I promise this is an art video. What's up everybody, this is the Shady Champ with the second installment of Artist Reacts. Last time we went over growing pains in the art I made as I started out, and this time I wanted to check all the improvements I made over time. I think it's really important if you're watching this as an artist, especially when you're starting out, to know that this is a process that only gets better as you continue going, much like these fighter skills in the background. Especially when you're at the point where I am in this story, where you want to better your style, but you're struggling to find the skills that you need. Add on to Burnout because a comic I made didn't come out the way I wanted to due to my lack of knowledge about what a DPI is and other things like that, and you find an artist that hadn't drawn nearly anywhere as much as I would have liked or should have. And then I played Deltarune. Say what you will about Deltarune, but there was something about Spamton G. Spamton that just resonated within me so much that the moment that I finished chapter 2, I immediately wanted to draw him. This was probably my fastest turnaround at the time between ooh, I want to draw this and then actually drawing this. I had multiple ideas about Spamton that I wanted to draw, so this inspired me to make variants of art pieces because I had a Twitter account that had a lot of followers, but I did actually just post anything on there, but it did have a good bit of attention versus an art account that only had maybe 2 followers at the time. But it would help both to be able to have an art account here and then an account that I could do whatever. And so posting on both could have a very good effect at seeing which account gets more attention, and hopefully things could work out on my end, and hopefully I could bring people from my main account to the art account. At this point, the line art's figured out pretty well, as I already have an idea about what I want each variant to be, because I absolutely wanted it to be in references to what he says. Granted, these Spamton artworks aren't the most committed to the style that Deltarune uses, but as this was day 3 of Deltarune chapter 2 being out, no one really knew what Spamton really looked like at the time, so you couldn't really make the most faithful thing on day 3. But this one is also like anchored in my style, so it's a really good advertisement of what I personally have to offer. We do a little Vine work, we make sure that we remember that he's actually a puppet, and then boom, we get something that I like. Now we move on to DC's The Spectre, one of the more experimental works I've done. When I made this piece, I had just finished reading a comic run by John Ostrander on that character, where a dead man gets a second chance at life after getting possessed by God's will of vengeance. There was no recommendations, no real reason for me to want to read that book, but I took a chance on it and I found it really enjoyable, though some 90s politics don't really age too well. The covers of each issue are often expertly painted, so for this piece I decided to break out of my comfort zone and take a more painterly approach as opposed to my more cel-shaded style. This was a bit of a challenge, but I found it fun painting shapes over my sketch layer instead of using line art. Though if I had to change anything, I would definitely paint the areas with a more solid brush first. I used a gouache brush for this because I like the texture of it, but it left a lot of transparent areas that I would have to go back to and recolor in order to make it look a bit more opaque. The Gaussian blur does help the transparency issues, and it also helps to make the Spectre look a bit more ghostly, so I guess it evens out a little. Then, because I wanted to make a mock-up of the covers, I copied the typography of his typical covers and used it for my piece. It's not the most popular fan art that I've made, but it's another one that I was motivated to make, and honestly, those kind of things make all the difference. This piece is unlike the ones in the first video because although it's a transition from the sketchbook to Procreate, I didn't use the sketchbook as a crutch. Rather, this sketch was an idea that I didn't take too seriously at first, but the more I looked at it, the more I wanted to see it digitally. At the time of this piece, I had been catching up with the manga Jujutsu Kaisen and playing the Shin Megami Tensei series and kept chuckling at myself at the concept of a crossover between the two. Of course, I also took advantage of the idea of using variants of Sukuna and Itadori having separate reactions to meeting the Demi-Fiend. At this point, I was using the variants not just for the reasons that I had already said, but also to see which account that the Twitter algorithm would favor between my normal account and the aspiring art account. At the time, Jujutsu Kaisen's movie was getting hyped up, so I took the opportunity to test this theory out. The result was unfortunately inconclusive, but it is what it is. If there's one word of advice from this piece to take away, it's to definitely experiment with these brushes and layer settings, especially in Procreate. Most brushes that I use to find these textures and line effects in these pieces would never have ever been used had I not just used them for the sake of curiosity. I was just messing around and finding out. As a result, the Demi-Fiend's tattoos get to pop, and the background is able to look as ethereal as some of those backgrounds in the Nocturne game. Added some shading and more of the aforementioned experimentation, and boom, you get a pretty cool piece, man. While the majority of these pieces we're going over are done in Procreate, every now and then I go to Clip Studio Paint as they have their own advantages over Procreate, like how their file sizes can be larger and they have a whole store so you can find cool brushes and materials, but more topically they allow you to use a 3D model for references. So as long as you have your posing game on point, complex poses don't actually have to scare you right away when you want to draw them. Unfortunately, I don't have the poses in this time-lapse because it's only halfway through this piece that I actually learned how to make a time-lapse in Clip Studio, which involved me updating it. But after the posing is done, the rest of this piece is actually pretty straightforward. This is another one of my variant pieces because I figure out as long as I'm going to draw art inspired by fighting games, it would actually be cool to use preferred colors for originality points in addition to the canon colors. This is my first time using vector layers for line art, which was a really fun experience, and my second time working on a brush that I had gotten from the Clip Studio store, which would have been a lot more fun if I had changed the setting of the brush. But I suppose if you can learn from something, it can't be all bad. Now this piece, I like a lot. In the intro, I touched on my having burnout, but I never got into detail about how bad it had actually gotten. While I won't go into full detail because no one actually needs to hear that for their day, I will say that when Guilty Gear Strive came out, I made 5 gestures of characters that I thought looked really cool. I also made a rough draft gesture of Juri because of the Guilty Gear momentum, and also because I really liked playing her in Street Fighter 4. However, shortly after making those gesture rough drafts, I really wasn't feeling my work at all. So much so that I decided to delete those rough drafts because at the time I honestly didn't have it in me to work on those pieces. But when I got to Juri, I thought to myself, I mean, I know I deleted 5 gestures already, but we can't go out that sad and delete a 6th. And I guilted myself into letting Juri stay. Admittedly, it would take literal months before I worked on it again because of those negative feelings that were attached to it. I mean, all the pieces that we just saw earlier in the video were done between me making that rough draft of Juri and then actually working on this piece again. Eventually, I did suck it up and start working back on Juri again. There were a lot of adjustments to the gesture and then later the line arts that had to be done, but I just really didn't want this piece hanging over my head anymore, and I didn't want to delete it either. My only option at that point was finishing it. I remember talking about how I turned off the pressure controls, and I eventually had to learn them. And it's a good thing that I did eventually learn them because this piece does not get made without pressure controls. Also, shout out to experimentation as well, because this is my first time using a light brush in order to make the energy for her kick, which doesn't really happen if I never go and experiment with all these brushes. I also believe that I used a technique of duplicating my line art, painting over that duplicate with a darker color of whatever that line was a border for in that character, and then applying a Gaussian blur over that color duplication. It makes a subtle but surprisingly effective difference in rendering, though it does take a bit of time to do for a not as obvious reward. And just like that, a piece that was initially one that had a lot of bad feelings around it became instantly one of my faves upon completion. Sometimes you really do just have to push through things when you're creating, and I think on that note we're going to call it here. Thanks for watching, and don't forget, another Artist Reacts is going to be up tomorrow, so don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you're making art yourself, drop some tips or share your art with your progress, and hopefully people can drop tips your way. Don't forget to ask anything either. So anyway, thanks for watching, goodbye.